June 24, 1812, Napoleon marches with the largest army Europe has ever seen into the heart of his former ally. Victory seems within reach, but the Russians stand resolute, retreating into the unforgiving winter. As the temperature plummets and supplies run low, what began as a grand conquest turns into a nightmare. Brace yourself for one of the most dramatic invasions in European history. In 1807, following his victory at Friedland, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia signed the Treaty of Tilsit, solidifying a temporary alliance. However, relations deteriorated over the next few years due to multiple factors. Napoleon's establishment of the Duchy of Warsaw was seen as a threat to Russian interests. By 1810, Alexander withdrew from the continental system, which was damaging Russia's economy. This move led to illicit trade with the British, infuriating Napoleon. The growing mistrust culminated in April 1812, when Alexander issued an ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of French troops from his territories. But Napoleon refused, and he mobilized the Grande Armée for an invasion. But before the invasion began, Russia secured diplomatic wins that bolstered its defense. In 1812, King of Sweden, former French Marshal Bernadotte, agreed to remain neutral, who became hostile to Napoleon after France seized Swedish Pomerania. Simultaneously, Russia signed a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire after long war. These two agreements secured Russia's northern and southern borders, freeing up troops to fight against Napoleon's Grande Armée. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, of around 600,000 troops from across the continent, but most of them were foreign troops, from different allies. The Duchy of Warsaw, Saxony, Bavaria, Westphalia, and Italy, and even recent enemies like Prussia and Austria. Napoleon's invasion force was divided into three main armies: the first army led by Napoleon himself, the second led by his adopted son, Eugene, Viceroy of Italy, and the third by his brother Jerome, King of Westphalia. On the left, Marshal MacDonald with the Prussian 10th Corps guarded the northern flank, while General Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps was in the right. Napoleon's cavalry, under Marshal Murat, served as the vanguard. Devout led the 1st Corps and Oudinot led the 2nd Corps. There were also 100,000 troops were in reserve. The Russian army was strategically positioned in three armies: Barclay de Tolly's 1st Army in the north, Bagration's 2nd Army to the south, and Tourmassar's 3rd Reserve Army in the southwest. The Russian army was around 250,000 troops. They were greatly outnumbered. On the 24th of June 1812, Grande Armée began crossing the Niemen River into Russia. Napoleon advanced north to Vilnius. His initial strategy was to defeat the Russian forces by separating them. Napoleon aimed to strike and defeat General Barclay de Tolly's army. Meanwhile, Jerome Bonaparte was ordered to hold Prince Bagration's army in place, with the ultimate goal of trapping both Russian forces. However, Barclay, a cautious commander, chose to retreat and burn villages and crops. Bagration, a more aggressive leader, refused to retreat. Only an order from the Tsar forced Bagration to retreat. After Napoleon reached Vilnius, but Barclay already retreated. Meanwhile, Jerome failed to hold Bagration, so Napoleon sent Marshal Davout, the 1st Corps, to trap Bagration, but he escaped the trap. Jerome struggled in his command, frustrated by supply issues and criticized by Napoleon, and failed to hold back Bagration's army. Ultimately, Napoleon reassigned Jerome's troops to Marshal Davout, leading a humiliated Jerome to abandon his post and return to his kingdom. The Russian scorched-earth strategy left the French army struggling to live off the land, and soldiers, unaccustomed to long marches, began to desert or collapse from exhaustion. The army had to make frequent stops, which slowed Napoleon's advance. After a brief rest at Vilnius, Napoleon resumed his advance. But Barclay continued his retreat to Vitebsk, hoping to unite with Bagration. But Davout blocked his path. At Vitebsk, Napoleon clashed with Barclay's rearguard, but the Russians escaped, burning supplies as they retreated. Meanwhile, the Russian Third Reserve Army had defeated the Saxon Seventh Corps at the Battle of Corbrin, forcing Napoleon to send reinforcements. By the end of July, Napoleon's army has suffered heavily from exhaustion and disease, which reduced his army to 200,000 men. Cossacks harassed French supply lines, forcing Napoleon to send troops for defense. After staying several days at Vitebsk, Napoleon received news of victories by Schwarzenberg and Bavarian forces, securing his flanks for the moment. It is now early August 1812. Napoleon's army has pushed deep into Russian territory. The Russians adopted scorched-earth policy, retreating while destroying villages, crops, and supplies to deny the French from any resources. The Grande Armée reduced to 200,000 men due to exhaustion, disease, and desertion. Barclay de Tolly and Bagration have retreated towards Smolensk. Napoleon focused on capturing Smolensk, aiming to draw the Russians into a decisive battle. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander, influenced by Bagration's criticisms of Barclay's continued retreats, demanded a more aggressive stance, pressuring Barclay to abandon his cautious strategy. By mid-August, Barclay de Tolly cautiously prepared for battle, his army now around 130,000 men. Barclay moved toward Rudnya. Believing Napoleon's forces were concentrated there, he ordered Platoff's Cossacks to attack the French cavalry corps. However, false reports of French movements to outflank his army forced Barclay to abandon the plan. Meanwhile, Napoleon seized the opportunity and launched a brilliant maneuver to outflank the Russians and cross the Dnieper River on August 14th. However, the Russian 27th Division put up fierce resistance near Krosly, delaying the French advance and giving Bagration time to reinforce Smolensk. By the time the French reached Smolensk, the opportunity for a decisive surprise attack was gone. As the Russian army began its retreat, the attack on Smolensk finally commenced 2 days later. Napoleon ordered a direct assault on the city's defenses. On August 16th, Napoleon launched a major assault with 3 corps and 200 artillery pieces. While initial successes set the city ablaze, the Russians refused to be drawn into open battle. Despite the Russians' bravery, the French and Polish forces breached the walls. On 17th of August, Barclay, fearing encirclement, ordered a retreat, and by evening of 18th of August the city was completely destroyed, just as the French forces entered. Napoleon, however, missed a crucial opportunity to trap the Russians. While Bagration's Second Army retreated first, Barclay's rearguard was caught by Ney's Third Corps at Valiatino. Yet General Junit, leading the Westphalian Corps, tasked to block Barclay's retreat, but failed to take action, allowing the Russians to escape. The French army suffered 12,500 casualties, while the Russians 13,500, and although the city was destroyed, no decisive victory was achieved. With the Russian forces successfully regrouping, Napoleon paused to plan his next moves. Napoleon faced a critical choice: push on to Moscow or halt for the winter. Pressing forward promised a decisive victory against a disorganized enemy, but carried enormous risks with the campaign season nearly over. Halting at Smolensk would allow his army to recover, but it risked giving Russia time to regroup. Napoleon chose to gamble advance, leading 120,000 troops toward Moscow in late August. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander also made a pivotal decision. The backlash against Barclay's cautious strategy became impossible to ignore. To restore morale and unify command, he appointed General Mikhail Kutuzov as commander-in-chief. Kutuzov had suffered a humiliating defeat by Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz 7 years earlier. However, in the Russo-Turkish War 1806–1812, Kutuzov achieved his greatest victory yet at the decisive Battle of the Danube, forcing the Ottomans to sign a peace treaty. Kutuzov shared Barclay's preference for delay, but recognized the need for a stand to rally the army and the nation. So in the west of Moscow, near Borodino, the Russians prepared for a decisive battle. A fateful day was approaching, one that would become the bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars for Europe. Napoleon reached Borodino on September 5th, but his advance was delayed at the Shevardino redoubt, a key position anchoring their left flank. That evening, Murat's cavalry engaged Konovnitsin's forces, driving them back toward the redoubt in fierce engagement. On September 6th, Napoleon launched a full assault. Kompan's division of Devout's corps attacked from the front, while Prince Poniatowski's Polish forces struck from the south. French artillery bombarded the redoubt as waves of infantry surged forward. The Russians, under Gorchakov, mounted fierce counterattacks. After hours of brutal fighting, the redoubt changed hands several times. But finally, as night fell, the battered Russians withdrew, ceding the redoubt. The French victory cost them 4,000 casualties. While Russian losses reached 6,000, the Russians retreated to their main defensive line. In June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with over 600,000 men, aiming to force Tsar Alexander to make peace. However, the Russians adopted a strategy of retreat, trading space for time. The campaign took a heavy toll on the Grande Armée, with disease, hunger, and exhaustion had reduced to the army to 120,000 troops, less than half its original size. By early September, Kutuzov decided to make a stand near Borodino to protect Moscow. The Russian army at Borodino, commanded by General Kutuzov, occupied a defensive position stretching across the new and old Smolensk roads. Barclay de Tolly's First Army anchored the right, protected by the steep banks of the Kutlo-Char River. The centre featured the massive Ravsky redoubt, an open-backed earthwork armed with heavy artillery, providing a clear field of fire over the central approach. On the left, Bagration's Second Army held a more exposed position, reinforced by earthworks, including the three arrow-shaped fleche. While the Shevardino redoubt was expected to delay the French advance, had fallen on September 6th. Despite this, Kutuzov maintained his initial deployment, relying on artillery and earthworks to delay Napoleon's attack. Meanwhile, on the other side, Marshal Devout proposed to Napoleon a bold flanking maneuver to exploit the exposed Russian left, but Napoleon rejected it as too risky. Instead, he concentrated his forces for a massive frontal assault. Around 6 a.m., the 102-gun French Grand Battery opened fire on the Russian defences. Marshal Devout's First Corps, led by Kompan's division with Decisive's division on the left. They faced strong resistance from Vorontsov's and Nevrovsky's Russian divisions, and Devout himself was wounded in the fighting. By 7:30 a.m., the French briefly captured the Flaches, only to be driven back by a fierce counterattack from Prince Bagration. Ney's Third Corps joined the attack, and Murat led a cavalry charge to repel a Russian cavalry counterattack. On the right, Poniatowski's Polish Fifth Corps advanced toward Utitsa, but struggled with difficult terrain and strong resistance from Tuchkor's Russian militia. On the left, Eugene's Fourth Corps attacked Borodino village, held by Russian Guard Jaegers. After clearing the village, Eugene's forces advanced toward the Ravsky redoubt, but were driven back. Despite heavy French artillery fire, Russian reinforcements, including Yermolov's horse artillery, unleashed a powerful barrage. In this counterattack, Russian General Kutuzov, chief of artillery, was killed in action leading one of these counter-attacks. To the south, Poniatowski's Polish Fifth Corps captured Atitsa after intense fighting. During the engagement, General Tuchkov was mortally wounded. However, the Polish advance was halted when Russian reinforcements, led by General Baghofwat, arrived to stabilize the position. In the center, the French launched 7 attacks on the Fleches, but each time they were repelled in intense hand-to-hand fighting. At his headquarters, Kutuzov left tactical decisions to Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration. At 11 a.m., Prince Bagration was hit by a cannonball, mortally wounded. He was carried from the field. The exhausted Russians began retreating in disarray, and the French finally captured the Fleches. Marshal Murat, seizing the opportunity, led forward Friant's division. Supported by heavy cavalry on both flanks, the Russians formed squares to repel the advancing French cavalry, while chaotic melees broke out between the opposing cavalry forces. Despite the Russians' fierce resistance, the relentless French pressure proved overwhelming. By midday, Friant's division pushed into the village of Semenovskaya, further destabilizing the Russian center. Napoleon, at his headquarters near Shevardino, was urged by his staff to commit the Imperial Guard as the Russian center wavered, but he refused. Instead, he ordered General Sorbia's Guard artillery to unleash a devastating barrage. Despite heavy losses, the Russians held, and the Guard remained in reserve. Around 11:30 a.m., Generals Platov and Uvarov led 8,000 cavalry and Cossacks across the Kutlocha River, targeting French and Italian troops near Borodino. Their surprise raid caused confusion, forcing Eugene to halt his attack on the Ravsky redoubt and pull back his forces. With no infantry support, Platov and Uvarov were unable to press their advantage and retreated. However, the raid delayed Eugene's assaults by 2 crucial hours, giving the Russians valuable time to reinforce their weakening defenses. Around 3 p.m., Napoleon ordered the final assault on the Ravsky redoubt. Led by Brusia's, Morin's, and Gerard's divisions, advanced under heavy Russian cannon fire. Russian defenders, including Likhachev's 24th Division, fought valiantly under the rallying cry, "Brothers, behind us is Moscow." As the French artillery bombarded the defenders, French cuirassiers charged through the rear of the redoubt, but suffered heavy losses. Saxon and Polish cavalry led daring charge into the rear of the redoubt, breaking through Russian infantry and gunners with many cut down as they stood their ground. Despite their fierce resistance, the redoubt fell by 3:30 p.m. and General Likhachev was captured. As French infantry secured the redoubt, Eugene ordered a cavalry advance to exploit the breach. However, the Russian Guard cavalry counterattacked, inflicting heavy losses on the advancing French. As dusk fell, fighting slowly died out across the battlefield. Mikhail Kutuzov, aware of the heavy toll on his army, chose to withdraw under the cover of darkness, retreating in good order. Napoleon had won the field but failed to destroy the Russian army, leaving his ultimate victory uncertain. In June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with over 600,000 men, aiming to force Tsar Alexander I into submission. The Russians retreated, employing scorched-earth tactics that left the French starving and exhausted. On September 7th, the armies clashed at Borodino, resulting in a costly Pyrrhic victory for Napoleon. A week later, on September 14th, his Grande Armée entered Moscow. To Napoleon's surprise, Moscow was deserted, and Governor Fyodor Rostopchin ordered the destruction of supplies to prevent their use by the French. Shortly after Napoleon's arrival, fires, allegedly set by Russian arsonists, engulfed 2/3 of the city, denying him a winter base. The French troops executed suspected arsonists and began looting the ruined city, but the occupation came at a heavy cost, with around 10,000 French soldiers lost in Moscow. Napoleon, seeking peace, sent a letter to Tsar Alexander, but received no reply. Hoping for a response, he delayed his departure, waiting too long. On October 13th, the first snow fell, signaling the approaching winter. Meanwhile, Russian reinforcements strengthened their position. On October 18th, Mikhail Kutuzov launched a surprise attack on Murat's forces at Borodino, inflicting 3,000 casualties, capturing 36 to 38 French guns, and destroying valuable French cavalry units. This was a heavy blow to Napoleon, forcing him to order an immediate evacuation of Moscow. On a rainy day, October 19th, 90,000 troops of the Grande Armée departed the city. Non-combatants, sick, and wounded accompanying the retreating army. These individuals, many unable to fight or march. At that time, Wittgenstein defeated Marshal St-Cyr, compelling Marshal Victor to provide reinforcements. Meanwhile, Admiral Chichagov drove the Austrians into retreat. Meanwhile, Napoleon sought to pass through Kaluga, aiming to secure supplies and easier route out of Russia. However, General Dokhturov's 6th Corps blocked the way. On October 24th, fierce fighting erupted at Maloyaroslavets, with the town changing hands 8 times, before Eugene's 4th Corps ultimately drove out the Russians. Although the French secured a tactical victory by holding the town, Napoleon decided to abandon this route and retreat northward. On October 25th, Napoleon narrowly avoided capture by Cossacks, thanks to the intervention of his grenadiers. After this close call, he began carrying a vial of poison around his neck as a safeguard against being taken prisoner. Napoleon, forced to retreat along the devastated Smolensk road, faced relentless Cossack raids and growing starvation. On October 29th, temperatures dropped below freezing, causing immense suffering as men and horses perished and discipline began to collapse. On the 3rd of November 1812, the French rearguard, led by Davout's 1st Corps, was caught by Russian forces in Vyazma. The French column became stretched thin. After intense fighting, Eugene's 4th Corps and Ney's 3rd Corps came to their aid, but the battle ended in brutal street fighting within the burning town of Vyazma. Despite their efforts, the French were forced to retreat, suffering heavy casualties. Ney's 3rd Corps formed the rearguard. On 4th of November, temperature plummeted to -15 degrees Celsius. Many soldiers froze to death. Many also deserted the army, but they were caught by Cossacks, who killed some, robbed others, and left many to freeze. Some foragers were even handed over to peasants, seeking revenge against them. Napoleon reached Smolensk on the 9th of November. Early French forces plundered the city's resources, leaving Ney's rearguard destitute. This scarcity, coupled with the army's weakened condition, forced Napoleon to continue the retreat. However, Napoleon spent 5 days at Smolensk, which gave Kutuzov the chance to prepare an ambush at Krosny. When the French army arrived, they were caught off guard, and in 3 days of fierce fighting, Napoleon ordered his Imperial Guard to hold the road open, allowing his forces to escape with enormous losses. The Young Guard launched a desperate attack to cover the retreat, suffering devastating casualties. Kutuzov, despite his advantage, delayed his pursuit. Ney's rearguard arrived at Krosny on November 18th, only to find the road blocked by the Russians. Rejecting calls to surrender, Ney led his men in a daring escape across the frozen Dnieper River at night, with Ney personally pulling men from the icy waters. Despite under constant attack from Cossacks, Ney and around 800 survivors reached Orsha, where their arrival was celebrated as a miraculous feat. Napoleon said, "The army of France is full of brave men, but Michel Ney is truly the bravest of the brave." After the Battle of Krosny, Napoleon narrowly avoided the complete encirclement of his army. However, 3 Russian armies were closing in: Kutuzov's main force of 60,000 from the east, Wittgenstein's 30,000 from the north, and Chichagov's 35,000 from the south. Napoleon's army was reduced to just 30,000 combat-ready troops, accompanied by numerous non-combatants. French supply depots at Polotsk and Vitebsk had already fallen to the Russians, cutting off critical resources. Napoleon set his sights on Minsk, home to vast supply stores. However, on November 21st, devastating news reached him: Minsk had fallen, along with Borisov and its crucial bridge. Marshal Oudinot and his resilient II Corps joined Napoleon's army and launched an immediate assault on Borisov, successfully recapturing the town. However, the Russians had destroyed the bridge over the Berezina River, hindering their progress. With the main bridge of Borisov destroyed, Napoleon's fortunes turned when Polish cavalry discovered a fordable location. Napoleon ordered a diversion by staging false preparations for a crossing in the south. Meanwhile, General Ebel's engineers, braving freezing conditions and often working chest-deep in icy water, completed 2 pontoon bridges in just 24 hours. Napoleon's forces began crossing the Berezina River using the hastily constructed pontoon bridges. General Oudinot led the vanguard to establish a defensive position on the west bank. However, Chichagov regrouped, and fierce fighting erupted. On the west bank, Oudinot was seriously wounded, but Marshal Ney took command, repelling Russian attacks with a decisive cavalry charge by General Dumas. Meanwhile, on the east bank, Victor's rearguard endured relentless assaults from Wittgenstein, holding their ground until nightfall before retreating across the bridges. At dawn on the 29th, in -30°C, thousands of stragglers panicked, rushing to the bridges. Many were crushed, drowned, or froze. When the bridges were burned later, those left behind faced the cold and advancing Russians, with most captured or killed. As the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered toward Vilna, temperatures plummeted to -37°C. Frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion claimed thousands of lives daily. The pursuing Russian armies paused, their task nearly complete. On December 5th, Napoleon departed the army, traveling incognito to Paris. He reached the capital in just 13 days, driven by the urgency of addressing a political crisis threatening his empire. While many perceived his departure as a betrayal, his generals defended it as a necessary move to safeguard the future of France. By December 9th, only 15,000 emaciated survivors crossed the Niemen River back into Polish territory. According to legend, Marshal Ney was the last man to cross. Just 6 months earlier, 600,000 men had marched into Russia. Now, fewer than 10% of that Grand Army remained. The French losses were staggering. 100,000 soldiers died in combat, 200,000 succumbed to other causes, such as starvation, exposure, and disease. An estimated 50,000 perished in captivity, 50,000 were wounded, 50,000 deserted, and 100,000 were taken prisoner.